So right now we've got our keynote speaker. He's John Bishop, professor of philosophy from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And he has done quite a bit of work in the philosophy of religion, and in particular on the epistemology and ethics of religious belief. His book from Oxford is this one, Believing by Faith. It's definitely well worth a read. So tonight he will be giving a talk about material related to that. So please help me welcome John Bishop.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm sorry I don't have any slides and I don't have a handout, but I would, if anyone were interested, be prepared to send a copy of this talk by email, if you just send me an email. So I should put up my email address somewhere at some point. And the talk I'm giving is called A Contemporary Jamesian Fideism, and it is indeed a way of articulating the kind of position that I was trying to defend in my book. But defending fideism seems a forlorn task for a philosopher. Fideism is widely understood as the claim that religious commitments are made by faith and are therefore made independently of any rational evaluation of what is believed and acted upon. But a philosopher surely is dedicated to reason and follows the argument where it leads, irrespective of inclination or preference. A philosopher fideist, it would seem, must be a dysfunctional philosopher. Yet it is far from obvious that faith sets aside the love of truth and the exercise of reason. To the contrary, religious philosophers typically hope for a harmony of faith and reason. They hope that commitments of the kind involved in religious faith will be consistent with adherence to the highest rational standards. Were that not so, what sort of a world would religion be proposing for our belief? It would be a world of cognitive dissonance, where religion requires setting aside rational capacities whose proper exercise we naturally assign to human excellence. It would be a world in which critical rationality may be denounced, perhaps as fallen, and the worth of religious commitment affirmed by authoritarian enthusiasm. A philosophical faith decisively rejects such extreme anti-rationalist fideism. But is a philosophical faith genuinely possible? May we satisfy ourselves that there is no stark choice between religious faith and commitment to philosophical values? And if we may, what are the conditions under which faith can be rational? And a further question which is not to be overlooked: what limitations on rationality may need acknowledgement in light of the possibility of reasonable faith commitments? Now, I defend the possibility of rational faith, yet I claim that faith essentially ventures beyond, though not against, what can be settled on the basis of evidence. I echo Kant's famous remark that knowledge needs to make room for faith. But my main influence is not Kant, but rather William James, and in particular his controversial lecture, The Will to Believe, which he introduces as, to quote, an essay in justification of faith, a defense of our right to adopt a believing attitude in religious matters, in spite of the fact that our merely logical intellect may not have been coerced. I think we may learn from James that defending a philosophical faith requires embracing a modest or moderate fideism, as opposed to an extreme anti-rationalist fideism. Such a fideism rejects, for the case of religious or similar faith, the evidentialist requirement that people's cognitive commitments should always accord with the weight of their total available evidence, according to objective standards of evidential support. This Jamesian fideism is nevertheless a rational fideism, because it accepts that faith commitments are open to rational critique. For one thing, they must at least cohere with evidence-based judgments. You don't get rid of concern about evidence altogether in moving beyond it. And they also are open to rational critique because the faith commitments that are being defended are seen, at least under certain conditions, as being in accordance with the proper exercise of our rational capacities. Now, in this address, I aim to describe this modest fideist understanding of faith and reason. Properly articulating the fideist view and setting aside common misunderstandings goes a long way, I think, towards recommending its acceptance. Indeed, I suspect that a recommendation is the strongest defence available. There seems to be no knockdown argument for moderate fideism, but nor for the kind of evidentialism that rejects it. Okay then, how should we understand faith as exemplified by, if not necessarily confined to the religious case? I do want to say that the same general kind of faith that is found in religion may appear in contexts which we don't usually think of as particularly religious. For example, it might be the commitment to a scientific naturalist worldview, or maybe commitment to basic ethical values may also need to be counted as faith commitments. Now, some accounts of faith are purely cognitive. They identify faith wholly as a kind of knowledge or belief, in the philosopher's technical sense of belief, as having the attitude towards a proposition that it is true. As the ordinary language notion of believing in someone or something suggests, however, there is an essentially active component to faith, which I've actually anticipated by already talking in terms of faith commitments. Faith commitments are practical commitments, affecting how one acts and lives one's life. If a practical commitment is furthermore authentically religious, then its effect on one's life will be a pervasive one. And I'm fond of observing that its etymology alerts us to an important feature of religion. It comes from the Latin word religere, which means to bind together. So a religious life is one in which all aspects of our existence are supposed to be bound meaningfully together, framed, as it were, by the content of our faith commitment. So though faith may not be purely cognitive, it involves a practical trusting and reliance on realities being a certain way, there does indeed have to be cognitive content to faith. Faith essentially involves taking the world to be a certain way. For example, in the case of theistic faith, it involves taking the world to be the creation of a God who is ultimately trustworthy. But theistic faith is not merely having the attitude that God exists and is to be trusted, it's also taking that claim and all that it implies to be true in one's practical reasoning towards decision-making and action, which is what I'm meaning, of course, by practical commitment. Now, faiths involving practical commitment entails that the justifiability of faith is not exclusively a matter of the justifiability of believing its cognitive content to be true. At root, the question about the justifiability of faith is about whether or not one is justified in making the practical commitment involved in faith. It's the question whether one's justified in taking it to be true in one's practical reasoning, that, if we continue with the case of theistic faith, God exists and is to be trusted, and is revealed thus and so. And perhaps a parenthesis is needed here to point out that religious theistic faith is always a matter of commitment, not just to the existence of God, but to this God, in the Christian case, to the one who is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, and so on. So the question of the justifiability of faith is thus a question about whether or not a certain kind of mental action is justified. And given the pervasiveness and significance of the consequences for one's own life, and indeed the lives of others, the sort of justification at issue, I say, must ultimately be moral justification. And that there is this concern, this moral concern about the justifiability of faith, is apparent from the contemporary critique that we get from the new atheists, such as Hitchens and Dawkins and Dennett and so on. They maintain not just that theistic belief is a mistake, but that it's a dangerous mistake. And their message is that human existence would be much improved if we could only grow out of our religiousness. Though, of course, as I'm sure you're well aware, these new atheists are not really so novel. They revive an ancient lament. I quote from Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, tantum religio potuit suadere malorum. And since this, I understand, is a Department of Philosophy and Classics, I won't translate that. So there is this moral concern expressed by the opponents of people who make the commitment of religious faith. They're saying, hey, you guys, you oughtn't to be doing this. You're letting the side down badly, right? But the moral justifiability of faith is also an issue which believers raise from themselves. It's not just something that is raised by opponents and outside, and then believers have to sort of react. Believers may become concerned about their entitlement to their particular faith, especially when they consider the implications of religious diversity. It's rather clear, had one been brought up in other circumstances, one would have been a Hindu, for example. So when believers become reflective, they may ask themselves, am I really entitled to my existing faith commitments? Is the ordering of my life that flows from my faith a right ordering, a proper orientation to reality? Is there perhaps a superior alternative to which I should convert? Or, less drastically, do I need at least to be open to developing my faith through critical reflection and perhaps by engaging with other traditions? And if I think I recognise in some other contemporary or historical faith commitments the tragic errors of fanaticism and the pursuit of what Paul Tillich tellingly calls false ultimacy, how do I know that I am not falling into the same trap? And I think such reflections from within the context of religious commitment are especially proper for believers within the monotheistic traditions, for whom the avoidance of idolatry is such a strong imperative. Could it be that the object of my present worship is something other than and lesser than the true highest one? Okay, let us grant then that faith involves a morally accessible practical commitment. As a commitment to realities being a certain way, however, faith must also be open to epistemic evaluation, that is, the kind of evaluation relevant to the epistemic goal of grasping truth and avoiding error. How then does the moral assessment of commitment to God's existing relate to the epistemic assessment of believing this proposition to be true? To this God's existing, I should say, as I mentioned earlier. On the face of it, surely, we will be morally justified in directing our lives on the basis of this God's existence, only if we are epistemically justified in holding that this is indeed the God who is. Epistemic justification in believing that seems a necessary condition for the related faith commitment to be morally justified. Now, there may be a way to avoid this moral epistemic link, but it goes back on the realist assumption that faith involves commitment to realities being a certain way, quite independently of any mental construction of how it is. Theological non-realism treats the theist worldview as a fiction, socially constructed to express and reinforce key values of the religious community. And on that view, the moral justifiability of theistic faith will presumably be assessed according to whether the values expressed are sound and commitment to acting in the light of the fiction conducive to promoting them. The fact that theistic traditions have clearly not understood themselves in this non-realist way is not perhaps by itself sufficient argument against theological non-realism. Nevertheless, it will suffice for present purposes to emphasize that the modest Jamesian Fideism I defend has it in common with evidentialism that it firmly retains the usual realist assumption about the cognitive content of faith. So very much within the context of trying to defend faith as going beyond the evidence, but as involving a practical commitment to realities being a certain way. On the realist view, the impulse to faith seeks an overall framework for living that latches onto what really is, and proceeds with a constant horror of being fobbed off with a fantasy, however grand and idealistic. Moral integrity in faith commitment thus absolutely requires epistemic integrity with respect to its factual cognitive content. In theistic terms, only a God who is fully real could be worth our ultimate thrust and commitment. And this kind of rejection that I'm making of theological anti-realism is, I think, the only conclusion that may be soundly drawn from the famous ontological argument, but I won't get into that, which might be a bit of a tangent. But it's not a tangent for me to want to emphasize that authentic faith must have epistemic integrity. But then the question is, what does epistemic integrity require? And this is the question that gives rise to the debate between the fideist and the evidentialist. To put it broadly, the evidentialist maintains that epistemic integrity always requires proportioning one's belief to one's evidence, so that a person's faith that P, for some proposition P, will have epistemic integrity only if the evidence available to him or her adequately supports its being true that P. That's what the evidentialist says. The modest fideist, by contrast, allows that under certain conditions it's consistent with epistemic integrity to commit to its being true that P, even though the believer, him or herself, recognizes that the available evidence does not, according to applicable laws, adequately support this claim. But the modest fideist is not recommending open slather. Concern that beliefs should enjoy evidential support is not simply set aside. Rather, what the fideist claims is that the proper attempt to settle important questions on the basis of evidence can come to a limiting point at which settling them without adequate evidential support is permissible. This kind of fideist agrees that epistemic integrity requires searching for evidence and respecting the evidence one finds, yet nevertheless maintains that believing beyond the evidence can, under certain conditions, be consistent with being fully committed to the epistemic goal of grasping truth and avoiding error. Now, one might think, remembering the new atheists perhaps, that the debate between evidentialists and fideists will be a debate between an epistemology adopted by and congenial to atheists and agnostics, and an epistemology adopted by and congenial to religious theists. But that is not the case. Theists weigh in on both sides of the evidentialist-fideist debate. Indeed, this debate is arguably at its most passionate when it occurs between two religious theists, both of whom accept the moral importance of epistemic integrity, but where one identifies maintaining this integrity with respecting an evidential requirement that applies as much to religious belief as to any other kind of belief, while the other regards it as essential that the person of religious faith makes a venture beyond the evidence with respect to belief itself, yet maintains that such a venture may accord with epistemic integrity more widely understood. The venture with respect to belief itself we may call a doxastic venture. So let me now explain then the conditions under which, according to the modest fideist, doxastic venture is permissible and consistent with the highest epistemic integrity. And this explanation will also clarify further just exactly what doxastic venture is. And I'll begin by considering the following formulation that William James, provides of his main thesis in The Will to Believe. He says, "Our passional nature not only lawfully may, but must decide an option between propositions whenever it is a genuine option that cannot, by its nature, be decided on intellectual grounds." Now, this claim both characterises the act of faith and provides criteria for its being justified. And I'll focus first on the act of faith and what it means to understand it as a doxastic venture. So what he said is we may decide an option between propositions, and you might at first suppose that that was a matter of deciding to believe the truth of a chosen proposition. But this cannot be what is meant, since James himself makes clear beliefs, in the sense of states of holding that a proposition is true, cannot be directly adopted simply at will. I think we can control our beliefs, but only by quite indirect methods. It's generally, but the possibility of directly choosing to believe seems to be ruled out. Certainly, James rules it out. So that's not what he means by when he says our passional nature not only lawfully may, but must decide an option between propositions. He doesn't mean deciding to believe the truth of a proposition. Rather, what I think James means by deciding an option between propositions is committing oneself in practice to the truth of the chosen proposition. Or in other words, taking that truth to be true in practical reasoning. And this is something that is under the direct control of the will. So the act of faith then is or involves an act of practical commitment to the faith proposition's truth. Now, when we practically commit to its being true that P, we usually already believe that P is true. And this is the standard case, though of course it's not the only case, since one may act on the assumption of a proposition's truth without at all believing that it's true. But I think the typical situation of the religious believer is of the standard kind, however. She has religious beliefs and she acts in accordance with them. But now let us suppose that when she considers whether she's justified in her religious beliefs, she comes to the conclusion that our evidence is not sufficient in accordance with a suitably objective evidential practice to support their truth. That realization might undermine her beliefs, but it need not. She might find that what causes her to hold and to continue to hold her religious beliefs does not also count as providing adequate evidence for their truth, according to applicable standards for adequate evidence. She might find, to put it in James's terminology, that what is causing her to hold her religious beliefs is some aspect of what he calls her passional nature. Now, here we encounter a crucial feature of James's psychology of belief, the insistence that belief is often caused in people passionally, or, to use a less potentially misleading term, non-evidentially, in the sense that the belief's causes do not also function as evidence adequate to justify the believer in accepting its truth. This applies rather obviously, I suggest, to the religious beliefs of a vast number of people. They believe because they were brought up to believe. They believe because they stand in a specific historical, cultural and religious tradition. But there are many such traditions, in significant respects cognitively incompatible with one another. So the fact that it is the belief of their progenitors and teachers that has caused their belief is not as such adequate objective evidence for its truth. The attachment of people to the beliefs of their own religious traditions is thus, I think, a clear case of non-evidentially or passionally caused belief. Now we see then what doxastic venture is. It is not, and could not be, a directly willed acquiring of a desired belief. Rather, it is a venturing to take to in practice what one already believes, but, as one becomes aware, believes through passional, non-evidential causes. So doxastic venture is a taking of a believed proposition to be true in practical reasoning, while recognizing the lack of adequate, objective, evidential support for its truth. Doxastic venture is thus possible only for someone who has and maintains non-evidentially caused belief. Well, having discovered, as we are supposing, that her religious beliefs are not adequately supported on the available evidence, our reflective believer is now concerned whether she's justified in continuing her practical commitment to their truth. She has religious belief, but from passional or non-evidential causes. Is it now acceptable to maintain her practical religious commitment in a doxastic venture? If so doing is morally acceptable only if it carries epistemic integrity, then it will be necessary for her to settle whether she is indeed epistemically entitled to her venture. Now, James claims that doxastic venture is permissible whenever it is a genuine option that cannot by its nature be decided on intellectual grounds. And he explains an option's being genuine as one that presents itself in the particular context, and these conditions are very decidedly contextual. It's that you can't read off from the fact that, the content of the faith proposition is that this God exists, that it's going to present a genuine option. It will depend on the circumstances of the person concerned. He explains this contextual feature of constituting a genuine option in terms of further features of options. It has to be live, forced, and momentous. And one can go into some detail in explaining what these things mean, but my gloss is that this condition restricts doxastic venture to commitments that are existentially vital, making a decisive difference to the kind of life one leads. And furthermore, what is existentially vital must be whether or not one actively commits to the truth of a given proposition. This is the requirement. The option must be forced. The choice must be to take this true or not. One can give an illustration of this with the case of the existential urgency of the evangelical call to let Jesus into your life. And I'm using this as an illustration. Whatever view one might have of this particular way of styling the challenge of the gospel, it illustrates this point very well. If you think about the traditional circumstance of the preacher urging people to let Jesus into their life and saying, come out now and make that commitment. What matters in this context, or is what is claimed to matter, is whether or not here and now you accept Jesus as your personal saviour. Remaining agnostic, leaving it open, perhaps for the sake of further inquiry, whether Jesus is or is not your saviour, is here, in practical terms, equivalent to rejecting the evangelical claim, or at least rejecting the evangelical claim for the present. Maybe you'll get another chance, maybe you won't be so lucky. But in either case, you do not here and now practically commit to the truth of the claim. I mean, there may be quite an important difference between the attitude with which you reject if you're agnostic than the attitude with which you reject if you just think that it's a whole load of rubbish. But if you, whether you're agnostic or whether you're positively rejecting, you are doing the same thing in practical terms, namely not accepting practical commitment to the truth that Jesus is your Saviour. So James is saying that only when a religious claim presents itself with this kind of forced urgency and importance could it be justified to adopt it in practice without adequate objective evidence. Actually, would you mind if I sat down? I think I can still just speak as loudly if I'm sitting down, but I'm getting a bit weary standing up. Hang on. So that is the first necessary condition, that in the context the option must present itself as genuine in the ways that I've described. But there's a further necessary condition. The question whether to commit must be such that it cannot be settled on intellectual grounds. And I take that to mean it can't be settled by evaluating evidence in accordance with applicable objective norms. An existentially vital forced option that might be settled, if only one waited for more evidence, may not therefore be resolved through doxastic venture. A fortiori, an existentially vital forced option that is settled on the available evidence may not be resolved in a contrary way. So what you might call counter-evidential doxastic venture is entirely excluded, and the ghost of anti-rationalist fideism is rather clearly laid at this point. Because if it's decidable by the evidence, right, then you can't decide it by a doxastic venture. So a fortiori, if you've got evidence that shows that it's false, right, you cannot then take it to be true by faith on James's view. So we can describe James's position as a supra-evidential fideism, if you like. Only supra-evidential doxastic venture can be permitted, and indeed only essentially supra-evidential doxastic venture can be permitted. That is, doxastic venture that goes beyond but not against the evidence. It's got to be essentially unable to be decided on the evidence if we take seriously the qualification that James gives, that the option of its nature not be open to intellectual resolution. Now, it might be objected that this requirement is too strong. Are there not cases where prudential or moral considerations override epistemic ones, so that believing beyond or even contrary to one's available evidence would be quite justifiable? And I owe this example to Trent Doherty. Suppose I find myself embarrassingly inclined to believe the conspiracy theory about the moon landings, even though I recognise that the objective evidence gives this belief little support. That's why I'm embarrassed. Now a genie appears, a genie who somehow has impeccable credentials, and promises that if only I commit to the falsity of the moon landing claims, if only I take that to be true in practice by, joining the appropriate crazy societies and making public speeches and all this kind of thing, if only I'll do that, he will confer some great boon on the world, maybe relief from a severe North African famine. Surely I shouldn't hesitate, thanking my lucky stars that, unlike very many people, by virtue of my quirky, non-evidentially caused belief, that there never were any moon landings, I'm actually able to make the required doxastic venture. It seems then that believing beyond or even against the evidence can be morally justifiable on occasions when epistemic concerns are trumped. And this, I think, is a concession that will be granted by any sensibly non-absolutist evidentialist. The requirement to proportion belief to evidence does not apply absolutely uniformly, but only within the scope of epistemic concern, which may on occasion be overridden by a higher concern. So you might say, well, what are we arguing about? These epistemic concerns can be overridden, so there could be a moral justifiability of believing beyond and even against the evidence on occasion. And maybe I've given this, imaginary example, but maybe you could find more plausible ordinary life examples. But it's important to recognize that the faith that the Jamesian Fideist holds to be justified is emphatically not, it does emphatically not involve any overriding of epistemic concern. The Jamesian Fideist takes the passion for truth to be intrinsic to authentic faith ventures of the kind exemplified in, as I've said, not necessarily confined to, the best religious cases. Religious and similar doxastic venture is thus permissible only when it stays firmly within the scope of epistemic concern. And that is why the Jamesian insists that it's only when an option could not in principle be settled evidentially that it could be permissible to commit in practice to the truth of a belief that settles it. Okay. But now, if you're an evidentialist, you will insist that epistemic concern, if it really is epistemic concern, it could never lead one properly to commit in practice to a truth claim beyond one's evidence. Except perhaps, they might say, in the case where a hypothesis is experimentally assumed true with a view to generating relevant evidence. But, you've still got a concern for evidence there. It's just that in this sort of situation, you're not going to get the evidence unless you experimentally take it to be true in practice. Right? But that exception, maybe some people might try to argue that it's that exception, which obviously a sensible evidentialist will make, that allows authentic faith commitments in. But that doesn't seem very promising, because surely authentic faith commitment is not merely experimental. The evidentialist's advice to our reflective believer then will be that if she does indeed find her religious beliefs to be non-evidentially caused and remains committed to the epistemic goal, she should not continue to act on them, and to avoid any such temptation, take all reasonable steps to eradicate her passional doxastic inclinations. With evidential resolution in principle unforthcoming for the religious claim that P, suspension of belief is required according to the evidentialist, neither believing that P nor believing that not P is epistemically justified, and at best I suppose one might afford its being true that P a credence of 0.5 in decision theoretical reasoning. The Jamesian Fideist response is to observe that if this evidentialist advice is taken, and if in fact there are existentially vital truths whose acceptance could not in principle be justified on the evidence, then such truths will remain forever outside our grasp, along with whatever benefits may flow from acting on them. Evidentialism, the Jamesian Fideist says, may thus block our access to truth, and so frustrate our epistemic goals and the further ends that they serve. Openness to doxastic venture, then, may be entirely epistemically responsible with respect to genuine, essentially and persistently evidentially undecidable options. Now, I think this Fideist response effectively adopts an epistemically external perspective on our cognitive situation. An epistemically internal perspective considers only factors accessible to us that affect the epistemic status of what we believe, factors which, in other words, could count for us as evidence for or against the truth of our belief. But an external perspective, which we might sort of take up imaginatively, even if we can't actually be so situated, an external perspective can envisage epistemically relevant factors that are not accessible to us, and so do not give rise to evidence for us. And as you are probably well aware, reliabilist epistemologies, for example, are externalist, holding that epistemic justification or worth can be conferred on a belief through its being caused by a mechanism that is reliable in yielding true beliefs. Now, I think what the fideist is supposing is that for all we know, our actual situation as viewed externally is that we can come to believe certain vital truths only through non-evidential causes, and thus be able to act upon those beliefs only through doxastic venture, only if we are prepared, only if, one, we have the good fortune to have beliefs which have these non-evidential causes, and we are prepared to take them to be true, actually to act on them. If that is so, then it will only be by trusting our wider nature, wider, that is, than our rational capacity for judging matters of fact on the basis of available evidence in accordance with our well-established and very important objective evidential practices. It'll only be by trusting the wider nature that important truths, such as foundational religious truths, may be appropriated. Well, now, evidentialists will no doubt reply with some impatience that we have abundant higher-order evidence for the view that our actual situation as viewed externally is one where we are likely to grasp truth and avoid error only by sticking to what is internally epistemically justified on the basis of our evidence. They might say, although what the fideist supposes is a bare possibility, in fact we're never justified in taking that possibility seriously with respect to our religious and similar options. The higher order evidence is just that the evidentialist policy works, or at least works well enough, and quite decidedly better than any policy that accepts beliefs that are caused by, to quote James, such factors as fear and hope, prejudice and passion, imitation and partisanship, or, lovely phrase here, the circumpressure of our caste and set, which I think describes the usual ways in which religious beliefs are caused. Evidentialists who are religious theists will also have been impatient with the assumption, which is certainly needed for Jamesian Fideism to apply to theistic faith commitment, that the question of belief in God's existence is incapable of being settled intellectually on the total available evidence. Theists who are also evidentialists must, of course, take this assumption to be mistaken. So far as their own live religious options are concerned, the question of justifying faith as a doxastic venture simply doesn't arise. Practical commitment to theism, they will think, accords with the epistemic justification of theistic beliefs on the available evidence. Well, fideists may respond first by agreeing that theists may properly regard their beliefs as adequately justified on the evidence relative to the norms of the relevant religious evidential practice. It's not as if religious beliefs don't have evidence, nor it's not as if the only evidence they have is purely subjective. There's a wealth of objective evidence. But it's very much evidence that counts objectively within the norms of a religious evidential practice. And that leaves it open whether any specific faith commitment, for example, to the Christian foundational belief that God is revealed in Jesus, it leaves it open whether such a foundational belief is evidentially justified relative to a more widely applicable evidential practice. Once committed to Christian belief, one is then subject to a local evidential practice internal to that commitment, a practice which applies hermeneutic protocols to sacred scriptures, for example, and which may admit certain kinds of religious experience as confirming religious beliefs. But the foundational Christian claim is itself open to assessment from a perspective that does not already assume its truth. And philosophers of religion, of course, assume a wider evidential practice and raise the question whether any foundational religious belief may be shown to be epistemically justified according to the norms that belong to this wider practice. And I'm here taking it for granted, I should say, that assessment of the epistemic justifiability of a person's belief in relation to evidence implicitly appeals to norms, both about what it is for evidence adequately to support a truth claim, and also about what is admissible as basic evidence, not itself in need of inferential support. The notion of evidence is at root just the notion of that which makes some truth evident or apparent. And this notion needs regimentation if objective or anyway intersubjective judgments of evidential support are going to be possible. And the norms that are relevant to such judgments are not going to be found on tablets of stone, but will need to be teased out as implicit in shared practices, the practices I've been talking about as evidential practices, practices that succeed in sustaining agreed judgments about the evidential justifiability of beliefs. So I think there certainly will be an evidential practice within the scope of, say, Christian commitment. But philosophers of religion are going to be interested in the question whether Christian commitment is justified from the perspective of a wider evidential practice. Right. And, of course, from that perspective, the question whether it's possible to provide non-question-begging argument and evidence to establish, or at least render significantly more probable than not, the foundational claim of theist belief that God exists, that has been much considered, as to, of course, the question whether it's possible to establish the denial that God exists. And the long history of this debate might well suggest that it is at an impasse. But it seems not to be the kind of impasse where all agree that the evidence is at the moment counterbalanced. Rather, many think the debate definitely resolved, but some think it resolved in favour of theism, others, apparently equally well motivated and competent, in favour of atheism. This suggests that the impasse is one of evidential ambiguity. The situation seems to be that the same overall body of evidence may be equally coherently interpreted either from, you might say, the gestalt of the theist or from that of the atheist naturalist. And furthermore, this will be no merely contingent matter if it is correct to see both theism and atheism naturalism as resting on highest order framing principles, that is to say, as involving commitment to stances on the nature of reality that frame our whole experience of the world, or the whole experience of the world of the person or community who makes commitment to those principles. Taking it that this God exists and is revealed thus and so is not a belief that could be epistemically secured by independent evidence, it may be, because it's the kind of belief that is brought to experience as a principle for making overall sense of all experience. And if that's so, no wonder that any piece of evidence atheists cite as persuasive can be interpreted by theists as consistent with their stance. So, okay, atheists find persuasive the existence of apparently pointless suffering, But theists can interpret that consistently as suffering whose connection with the good is fully apparent to God alone. And no wonder, too, that proofs of theism turn out always to rest on assumptions that can reasonably be rejected by the naturalist atheist. So, for example, the new teleological argument, the argument from fine-tuning, which can seem quite impressive, that can be interpreted by the fine-tuning can be interpreted by the naturalist atheist as brute fact, or even perhaps as just naturally necessary. Now, what I'm saying here is all quite controversial about that debate, about whether, from the point of view of a wider objective evidential practice, we can settle the question of whether God exists or not. I don't really want to pursue the controversy further. But what I'm trying to do is indicate that what context it is for which the Jamesian justification of faith is fitted. So in other words, I'm completely conceding that, if you're a Swinburne and you think you can pursue the project of natural theology to show that from the point of view of that wider evidential practice, we can show that it's reasonable not only to think that God exists, but that the Christian God exists, right? Then there will just be, you won't be the least bit interested in a sort of Jamesian justification for faith. There will be no need for doxastic venture. You will be committing yourself in accordance with your evidence. But what I want to say is there are quite a lot of people who might, disagree with Swinburne, and who may think that the situation is much more likely to turn out to be one of evidential ambiguity. And if they want to explain how taking this, making religious commitment under those circumstances might be justifiable, then this Jamesian approach is just the kind of thing that they're going to need. That's what I'm saying. I think what I have said, then, is enough to show why doxastic venture in making a faith commitment may be consistent with epistemic integrity. The fact that epistemic integrity requires applying the evidentialist policy in those many contexts where evidence can be expected to settle justified belief, where evidence can be expected to settle justified belief, does not give sufficient reason to conclude that it must do so in contexts of, in principle, evidential ambiguity. So if the context of theistic faith commitment is the resolving of a forced choice in the face of an in principle evidential ambiguity, then from an external perspective it may be that doxastic venture in favour of passionately motivated belief in God gains us the vital truth. But there's no way of eliminating... But equally, of course, I mean, it may be that the situation is we're only going to get the truth if we make the doxastic venture. However, one has to admit that equally, such a venture may result in a failure to align ourselves with the truth. James talks a lot about in his lecture about getting worried about being duped. Right, we may end up being quite duped if we of all people would be the most foolish if it turns out that we've accepted the truth of the resurrection as something to found our lives on, and it just didn't. No such reality. But the point is, there's no way of eliminating that risk when the option is vital and forced. Forced either to commit in practice to this God's existence or not, I run the risk of not aligning my will with the truth however I choose. Now, of course, by suspending belief, I avoid all risk of error in my belief states. But how much satisfaction can I take in that? What good is that to me if I fail to live my life in the light of God's existence, when, as it turns out, God's existence is the deepest truth about the real world in which I live and move and have my being? So the Stoics get another outing. A Jamesian Fideist defence of theistic faith assumes then that theistic faith commits in practice to God's trustworthiness on the basis of a belief that has non-evidential causes, in a context where the option to make that commitment or not is existentially vital and in principle unable to be settled through a rational assessment of the independently available evidence. That is, evidence that does not already presuppose the existence of the trustworthy God. Where our capacity to assess an important truth claim in relation to our evidence runs out, and yet it is vital that we decide whether or not to act upon it, how could accepting in practice what we are anyway passionately motivated to believe be contrary to the right exercise of our rational capacities? For Jamesian Fideists, that question is of course a rhetorical one. Their claim is that doxastic venture on a forced and vital question incapable of evidence-based resolution does indeed fully accord with right reason. And this, of course, is a permissibility claim only. There's no obligation to make any particular faith commitment. And furthermore, alternative and contrary faith commitments may be equally in accord with the right exercise of reason. And so Jamesian Fideism thus undergirds religious pluralism, and indeed a broader pluralism, allowing non-religious faith commitments, and even, if this is psychologically possible, which perhaps it isn't, abstention from faith commitments altogether. Fideist defenders of theism may provide a theological context for their claim that doxastic venture under the stated conditions accords with the right exercise of human capacities. What may God, if he exists, properly expect from us if, as assumed, theism is in principle evidentially ambiguous? Locke, a classic theist evidentialist, writes that one who, quote, believes without having a reason for believing may be in love with his own fancies, but neither seeks truth as he ought, nor pays the obedience due to his Maker, who would have him use those discerning faculties he has given him. But if, contrary to Locke's own view, God's existence is evidentially ambiguous, obedience to our Maker in the proper use of our discerning faculties will require accepting that these faculties have limits, and the theological interpretation of the ambiguity will be that God has good reason to desire us to commit ourselves in the absence of the rational certification assessment of evidence could supply. Thus, the doxastic venture need by no means be in love with his own fancies, but may rather be responding to the deepest promptings of his wider nature and situation. Thank you.